The bell chimed, slicing through the thick, bloody silence of the closed bakery. Sylvia clutched her worn purse, unaware of the loaded Glock resting on the mahogany table just 2 feet behind her. "Please," her voice broke, shattering the tension. "Do you have any leftover cake for my daughter?" The shadows shifted. The torrential rain of late October turned the cobblestone streets of Boston's North End into slick, black mirrors. Sylvia Hayes stood under the flickering neon sign of Patisserie Nouvelle, shivering in a trench coat that was 3 years old and utterly incapable of keeping out the damp cold. Her auburn hair clung to her cheeks in wet tendrils, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the crushing weight in her chest. Today was Mia's 7th birthday. Sylvia's bank account currently held exactly $6.14. Every penny she had saved over the last 4 months had been violently seized by the collection agencies. Her ex-husband, a charming but fundamentally broken man named Greg, had vanished into the wind 2 years ago, leaving behind a mountain of illicit gambling debts and a string of dangerous men looking for their money. Sylvia had paid the price, selling her car, her wedding ring, and working double shifts at a diner just to keep a roof over Mia's head. But tonight, she had failed. She had promised Mia a cake, a real cake with pink frosting and candles, when her shift had run 3 hours late because a coworker called in sick. Sylvia had missed the closing times of every affordable grocery store in the district. Desperation is a cold, hollow thing. It strips away pride. It had driven Sylvia to the glass doors of Patisserie Nouvelle, a high-end bakery she walked past every day but could never afford to enter. The closed sign was flipped outwards. The main lights were off, save for a dim, warm amber glow emanating from the back kitchen. Sylvia pressed her palm against the glass. She could see a few display items still sitting in the refrigerated case, flawless, towering confections that would likely be thrown out or donated in the morning. She rattled the heavy brass handle. To her surprise, the latch clicked. The door wasn't locked. She slipped inside, the little brass bell above the door ringing out with a sharp, cheerful chirp that felt entirely out of place in the dark. "Hello?" Sylvia called out, her voice trembling. The air inside smelled intoxicatingly of spun sugar, rich vanilla bean, and dark chocolate. But beneath the sweetness, there was a sharp, metallic undertone that Sylvia couldn't quite identify. It smelled vaguely of copper. Behind the counter, a woman in a flour-dusted apron stepped out from the swinging kitchen doors. It was Genevieve, the owner. Sylvia recognized her from the neighborhood, but Genevieve didn't look like the cheerful artisan who usually greeted the morning commuters. Her face was ashen, drained of all color. She was sweating profusely, her eyes wide and darting frantically around the dimly lit room. "We're closed," Genevieve whispered, her voice barely a squeak. "You need to leave. Right now. Please." Sylvia took a step forward, oblivious to the sheer terror radiating from the baker. "Genevieve, I am so sorry to intrude. I know you're closed, but I live just down on Hanover Street. My daughter, it's her birthday today. I just got off work, and everywhere else is shut down." Genevieve's eyes darted nervously over Sylvia's shoulder, focusing on the deep, velvet-lined booths at the far end of the bakery, shrouded in complete darkness. "I can't help you. The registers are closed. Get out. For your own good, get out." Sylvia swallowed her pride. The tears that had been threatening to spill all night finally breached her lashes. "I don't have money for a fresh one," she confessed, her voice cracking in the quiet room. I saw the ones in the display, the ones you throw away. I was hoping. I was praying." She gripped the edge of the marble counter, her knuckles turning white. "Please," Sylvia begged, the raw agony of a failing mother echoing off the tiled walls. "Do you have any leftover cake for my daughter?" Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Genevieve looked like she was about to faint. She didn't answer Sylvia. Instead, she stared in frozen horror at the dark booth right behind where Sylvia was standing. Sylvia frowned, confused by the baker's paralyzing fear. Slowly, she began to turn her head to see what Genevieve was looking at. Before she could fully turn, a voice drifted out from the pitch-black corner. It was a baritone, rich and terrifyingly calm, raspy with pain. Give her the strawberry one. The whole tier, Dominic Castiglione, was bleeding out on a floral-patterned velvet cushion. Less than 30 minutes ago, the cobblestones of the North End had been a war zone. Dominic, the undisputed head of the Castiglione crime family, had been walking back to his armored SUV after a private dinner when the rival Kozlov syndicate broke a 5-year ceasefire. The ambush was brutal, efficient, and devastating. 3 of his best men were dead in an alleyway off Battery Street. Dominic had managed to put 2 bullets into the chest of his primary attacker before taking a ricochet to his lower abdomen. He had stumbled into Patisserie Nouvelle, a building he technically owned through 3 shell companies locking the heavy deadbolt behind him. Or so he thought. The latch hadn't caught properly. For the past 10 minutes, he had sat in the absolute darkness of the corner booth, pressing a wad of expensive silk napkins against his bleeding side, his silenced Glock 19 resting on the mahogany table. He had been waiting for his extraction team to arrive, watching Genevieve quietly panic in the kitchen, silently commanding her to stay put. When the front door opened, Dominic had raised his weapon. He had the crosshairs aimed squarely at the center of the intruder's chest. His finger rested on the trigger, applying a hair of pressure. But it wasn't a Kozlov hitman. It was a woman, soaked to the bone, shivering, and clutching a cheap faux leather purse like it was a shield. Dominic watched her from the shadows, his breathing shallow to manage the searing pain in his gut. He listened to her stammering apology, her frantic, pathetic plea. He was a man who trafficked in power, violence, and intimidation. He had watched grown men weep and beg for their lives without feeling a single tremor of sympathy. But when Sylvia's voice cracked when she laid her utter failure as a parent bare in front of a stranger, begging for scraps, so her little girl wouldn't wake up disappointed, something deep within Dominic's fractured conscience snapped. It was a ghost from his past, a visceral, violent memory of his own mother in Palermo, 30 years ago, begging a ruthless baker for stale bread to feed him and his brother, only to be struck across the face. Dominic had burned that bakery to the ground when he was 16. The silence in the room had become unbearable. Genevieve was too paralyzed to speak. Sylvia was turning around. That was when Dominic spoke. Give her the strawberry one. The whole tier. Sylvia froze. The voice was so close it made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. It came from the booth literally 2 feet behind her. She turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. In the dim ambient light filtering from the street lamps outside, she saw him. A man in a ruined, bespoke charcoal suit. His face was a study in harsh angles and shadowed brutality, sharp jaw, patrician nose, and eyes as dark and cold as the bottom of the ocean. One of his hands was pressing down on a dark, spreading stain on his white shirt. The other hand rested casually near a very large, very real handgun on the table. Sylvia's breath hitched. Her survival instincts screamed at her to run, to bolt through the door and vanish into the rain. But her legs refused to move. Who? Sylvia whispered, her eyes darting from the blood to the gun. Pack the cake, Genevieve, Dominic commanded, his gaze never leaving Sylvia. His voice was softer this time, though the authority in it was absolute. And a box of those macarons. The little girl should have options. Genevieve snapped out of her stupor. She scrambled to the refrigerated case, her hands shaking violently as she pulled out a pristine, 3-tiered strawberry shortcake that easily retailed for $100. She fumbled with a large, pink cardboard box, folding the tabs with frantic speed. Sylvia took a step back, her hands raised slightly. I can't take that. I don't have the money for. It's paid for, Dominic interrupted. He grimaced slightly, shifting his weight. A fresh wave of blood soaked through the silk napkin. Take the cake, Signora. Go home to your daughter. Forget you ever stepped foot in here tonight. Sylvia was terrified, but she was also a mother. The pink box Genevieve slid across the counter was a beacon of salvation for Mia's ruined birthday. She approached the counter, picked up the heavy box, and turned back to the man in the shadows. Thank you, she said, her voice trembling. You're hurt. Do you need me to call an ambulance? Do not finish that sentence, Dominic said, his eyes narrowing, a sudden flash of lethality in them. Walk out the door. Now. Sylvia nodded, stepping backward toward the exit. She reached for the brass handle. Outside, the squeal of tires cut through the sound of the rain. A black Lincoln Navigator slammed onto the curb directly in front of the bakery, its headlights flooding the dark interior with blinding, aggressive light. Dominic's eyes widened. He recognized the vehicle. It wasn't his extraction team. "Get down!" Dominic roared, abandoning his wound and lunging forward with terrifying speed for a man who had just been shot. Sylvia didn't have time to react. The world exploded. A hail of automatic gunfire shattered the front windows of Patisserie Nouvelle. Glass sprayed like deadly confetti through the air. The beautiful, pristine cakes in the display case were blown to pieces. A tragic storm of pink frosting, shattered glass, and flying lead. Dominic hit Sylvia at the waist, tackling her to the cold, tiled floor just as a line of bullets stitched across the mahogany counter where she had been standing a second before. He covered her body with his, shielding her from the shrapnel as the deafening roar of the gunfire echoed relentlessly in the small space. Underneath him, Sylvia screamed, dropping the pink box. The strawberry cake spilled out onto the floor, crushed instantly under Dominic's heavy combat boots as he dragged her violently behind the solid marble base of the serving counter. "Stay perfectly still," Dominic hissed in her ear, pulling the slide back on his Glock. The smell of copper was suddenly overwhelmed by the acrid stench of gunpowder. Sylvia sobbed, curled into a tight ball on the floor, her hands over her ears. The leftover cake she had begged for was ruined, smeared across the floor amidst broken glass and shell casings. And the terrifying man bleeding above her was now the only thing standing between her and a firing squad. The air inside Patisserie Nouvelle was instantly choked with pulverized drywall, powdered sugar, and the bitter, sulfurous sting of spent ammunition. The barrage lasted for 10 agonizing seconds, a lifetime when you are pinned to the floor, waiting for a stray bullet to end your existence. Sylvia squeezed her eyes shut, her face pressed against the cold, sticky tiles. The strawberry cake, her singular mission for the evening, was a ruined smear of pink cream and sponge beneath Dominic's heavy boot. She couldn't breathe. The weight of the Mafia boss on top of her was crushing, his blood soaking through her cheap trench coat, binding them together in the chaos. Suddenly, the deafening roar from the street ceased, replaced by the sharp crunch of heavy boots advancing over broken glass. "They're moving in to confirm the kill," Dominic rasped, his breath hot against Sylvia's ear. He rolled off her, wincing as his abdominal wound tore further. "Stay down. Do not make a sound, no matter what happens." Sylvia nodded frantically, her hands trembling so violently she couldn't clasp them together. She watched, paralyzed by a morbid terror, as Dominic pushed himself up into a crouch. He didn't look like a man who was bleeding to death. His movements were fluid, calculated, and predatory. He wiped a streak of dust from his eyes, raised the Glock, and rested the barrel against the edge of the marble counter. Two silhouettes stepped through the shattered storefront. They wore dark, tactical gear, their faces obscured by ski masks, carrying suppressed submachine guns. Dominic didn't hesitate. He fired 3 times in rapid succession. Thwip, thwip, thwip. The silencer on his weapon masked the true violence of the shots, but the results were instantaneous. The first gunman dropped like a stone, a neat hole punched through his visor. The second man spun wildly, firing blindly into the dark, but Dominic was already moving. He fired twice more, catching the second hitman in the throat. The man collapsed backward into the street, his weapon clattering onto the wet cobblestones. "Genevieve," Dominic barked, his voice cutting through the ringing silence. A muffled whimper came from the back. "I'm in the walk-in freezer!" The baker cried out, her voice thick with panic. "Stay there. Lock it from the inside," Dominic ordered. He turned back to Sylvia, reaching down with his uninjured arm. "Get up." "I can't," Sylvia sobbed, her legs feeling like lead. "My daughter. I need to get home to Mia. If you stay here, you die. More of them will come," Dominic said, his tone devoid of any comforting warmth. It was a cold, hard fact. He grabbed her by the lapel of her coat and hauled her to her feet with shocking strength. You are coming with me. Move. He shoved her toward the swinging doors of the kitchen. They stumbled through the dark, the only light coming from the industrial oven's digital displays. Dominic leaned heavily against the stainless steel prep tables, leaving a smear of crimson in his wake. His breathing was growing shallower. They reached the heavy steel fire door at the back of the alley. Dominic kicked the release bar, shoving Sylvia out into the freezing rain. The alley was a narrow, claustrophobic corridor of brick and overflowing dumpsters. The downpour instantly soaked them both anew. Before they could take 3 steps, the roar of an engine echoed from the mouth of the alley. A massive, matte black Mercedes G-Wagon skidded to a halt, blocking the exit. Sylvia screamed, instinctively stepping back. But Dominic grabbed her wrist, his grip like a vice. It's mine, he gritted out. The rear door of the G-Wagon swung open, and a towering man with a broken nose and a tailored suit stepped out, an assault rifle slung across his chest. This was Vincent, Dominic's underboss. "Boss!" Vincent yelled over the rain, his eyes widening at the amount of blood soaking Dominic's shirt. "We heard the chatter on the scanners. Kozlov's men?" "Yeah," Dominic said, his knees finally buckling. Vincent rushed forward, catching the Mafia Don before he hit the pavement. "Get us out of here, Vince. Now." Vincent looked at Sylvia, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Who the hell is she?" "Collateral," Dominic murmured, his eyes rolling back slightly. "She comes with us." Vincent didn't argue. He practically threw Dominic into the back seat and gestured violently at Sylvia. "Get in, unless you want to explain all this to the cops or the Russians." Sylvia scrambled into the luxurious, leather-scented interior of the SUV. The doors slammed shut, sealing them in a soundproof vault. The engine roared, and the Mercedes reversed out of the alley at breakneck speed, its heavy armored tires tearing through the flooded streets of Boston, leaving the nightmare of the bakery far behind. Sylvia sat frozen against the passenger door, staring at the terrifying man bleeding out on the seat next to her. Her mind violently rejected everything that had just happened. She had only wanted a piece of leftover cake. Now, she was covered in blood, speeding through the dark in a bulletproof car with the Mafia. The safe house was a sprawling, subterranean medical facility hidden beneath an unassuming luxury car dealership in Beacon Hill. To the outside world, it was a storage sub-basement. Inside, it was a state-of-the-art trauma center funded by illicit millions. Sylvia paced the length of the sterile white waiting room, her wet shoes squeaking against the linoleum. It had been 2 hours since Vincent had carried Dominic through the heavy blast doors. A private surgeon, a man Vincent called Dr. Sterling, had immediately begun operating. Every time Sylvia tried to approach the exit, a brick wall of a man named Rocco gently but firmly blocked her path. "I need to make a phone call," Sylvia pleaded for the 10th time, looking up at Rocco's impassive face. "My babysitter, Mrs. Gable. She's an older woman. She was only supposed to stay until 9. It's almost midnight. She's going to call the police if I don't check in." "No outgoing calls, ma'am," Rocco rumbled, his arms crossed. "Security protocol." "You don't understand. My daughter is 7 years old today. I have to." The heavy double doors of the operating room swung open. Dr. Sterling stepped out, peeling off a pair of bloody latex gloves. Vincent was right behind him, looking grim. "He's stabilized," Dr. Sterling said, looking at Vincent. "The bullet missed the liver by a fraction of an inch, but he lost a massive amount of blood. I've given him a transfusion. He needs rest, but he's conscious, and he's demanding to speak to the woman." Vincent nodded and turned his cold gaze to Sylvia. Sylvia swallowed hard. She walked past the doctor and entered the recovery room. The air smelled of iodine and bleach. Dominic was lying in a hospital bed, his torso heavily bandaged. The harsh, fluorescent lighting highlighted the sharp, unforgiving planes of his face. He looked pale, almost spectral, but his dark eyes were unnervingly alert. "Come closer, Signora," Dominic said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. Sylvia took 2 tentative steps forward, stopping at the foot of the bed. "Are you going to let me go now?" "I didn't see anything. I swear. I won't tell anyone." Dominic studied her. He took in her frayed coat, her exhausted, tear-streaked face, and the desperate maternal terror radiating from every inch of her. "What is your name?" he asked quietly. "Sylvia," she answered, her voice trembling. "Sylvia Hayes." The heartbeat monitor attached to Dominic's chest suddenly spiked. A rapid beep, beep, beep filled the quiet room. Dominic's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened, turning into two bottomless pits of obsidian. "Hayes," Dominic repeated, the word tasting like poison on his tongue. "What is your husband's name?" Sylvia flinched. "Ex-husband. He left us 2 years ago. His name is Greg. Greg Hayes. But I don't know where he is. I swear to you, whatever he did, Mia and I have nothing to do with it." Dominic closed his eyes, letting his head fall back against the pillows. A dark, humorless chuckle vibrated in his chest, turning into a wince of pain. "The universe has a remarkably twisted sense of irony," Dominic murmured. He looked back at Sylvia, the pity he had felt for her in the bakery entirely replaced by a cold, calculating intensity. "What do you mean?" Sylvia asked, a new kind of dread settling in her stomach. "Vincent," Dominic called out. The underboss stepped into the room instantly. "Yeah, boss?" "Greg Hayes," Dominic said, watching Sylvia's face. "The rat who skimmed 300 grand off our docks last year. The one who vanished before we could break his legs." Vincent's jaw tightened. "I remember him. He didn't just vanish, Vince," Dominic continued softly. "He crawled to the Kozlovs. He's been hiding under their protection, and I would bet my life that Greg is the one who fed them my location tonight. He was the accountant for that sector. He knew the shell company that owned the bakery. He knew my audit schedules." Sylvia felt the blood drain from her face. The room spun. Greg. It was always Greg. Even 2 years gone, his toxic, selfish choices were still reaching out to destroy her and Mia. "No," Sylvia whispered, clutching her stomach. "No, he wouldn't. He knows we live in this neighborhood. He wouldn't risk us." "Men like Greg Hayes don't care about collateral damage," Dominic said ruthlessly. "He sold me out to clear his debt with the Russians. But tonight, the Russians saw you in that bakery, Sylvia. They saw me risk my life to protect you. They don't know who I am. They have cameras. They have facial recognition," Dominic snapped, his patience wearing thin. "By tomorrow morning, they will know exactly who you are. They will realize you are Greg Hayes' ex-wife, and they will think I am using you to get to him. Or worse, they will use you to punish him if he steps out of line." Sylvia couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in. "Mia," she choked out, sheer panic taking over. "My little girl is at the apartment. If they find out who I am," Dominic shifted his gaze to Vincent. "Give me the address, Sylvia." "No," she cried, backing away. "I'm not giving my daughter to the Mafia. I'll go get her myself. We'll run." "Run where?" Dominic demanded, his voice echoing sharply in the sterile room. "With what money? The $6 you couldn't use to buy a cake? If you walk out of that door, the Kozlovs will have you in the back of a van before dawn, and your daughter will be sold to the highest bidder overseas. Is that what you want?" Sylvia broke. A ragged sob tore from her throat as she collapsed into a plastic chair in the corner of the room, burying her face in her hands. She was utterly trapped. Dominic watched her weep. The ruthless, pragmatic side of his brain told him to use her. She was leverage. She was the bait to lure Greg Hayes out of hiding and cripple the Kozlovs. But the ghost of his past, the memory of a desperate mother begging for scraps, refused to be silenced. "Give Vincent the address," Dominic said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming surprisingly gentle. "I will send a team to secure your apartment. They will bring your daughter and the babysitter here, safely. I swear it on my life." Sylvia looked up, her eyes red and utterly defeated. She had no choice. She was making a deal with the devil, but it was the only way to save her child. She rattled off the address on Hanover Street. Vincent typed it into a burner phone and sprinted out of the room, barking orders to Rocco in the hallway. Dominic looked at Sylvia, who was shivering in her blood-stained coat. "You didn't get your cake tonight, Sylvia," Dominic said quietly, staring at the ceiling. But I promise you, by the time this is over, the men who ruined your daughter's birthday will be nothing but ash. The rain battered the cracked pavement of Hanover Street, masking the sound of 3 matte black SUVs cutting their headlights and rolling to a silent halt outside Sylvia's apartment building. Inside the mobile command center of the lead vehicle, Vincent stared at the thermal imaging feed on his tablet. 4 heat signatures in the apartment, he growled into his radio. Too small, too large. The door's already been kicked. The Kozlovs beat us here. Back at the underground medical facility, the radio feed was patched directly into the sterile recovery room. Sylvia sat rigidly in her plastic chair, her face devoid of color, her fingernails biting into her palms until they bled. Dominic Castiglione, heavily bandaged and pumped full of combat-grade adrenaline by Dr. Sterling, sat up against the hospital bed's rails. He was pale, but his eyes burned with a terrifying, calculating fire. "Breach it, Vince," Dominic commanded, his voice a gravelly rasp over the comms. "Do not let them take the girl." "Copy that, boss," Vincent replied. In the cramped hallway of the 4th floor, Vincent and his elite retrieval team stacked up against the splintered door of apartment 4B. The smell of cheap whiskey and wet wool seeped into the corridor. Inside the apartment, chaos reigned. Drawers were upended, and the meager furnishings Sylvia had scraped together were slashed to pieces. In the center of the living room, Greg Hayes, Sylvia's ex-husband, was frantically tearing apart a faux leather ottoman. He looked feral, his clothes rumpled, sweat pouring down his unshaven face. Standing over him was Sergei Kozlov, a hulking Russian enforcer with a spiderweb tattoo crawling up his throat. Sergei had a suppressed Makarov pistol pressed firmly against the temple of Mrs. Gable, the elderly babysitter, who was weeping silently on the floor. Tucked behind Mrs. Gable, clutching a ratty stuffed bear, was 7-year-old Mia. Her wide, tear-filled eyes watched her father tear their home apart. "It's not here!" Greg shrieked, throwing cushions across the room. "I swear to God, Sergei, she must have moved it. The ledger was taped under this chair." "You have wasted my time, Greg," Sergei rumbled, his thick accent dripping with malice. "And you know what the boss does to men who waste his time." Sergei shifted his aim, pointing the gun directly at little Mia. "No, wait," Greg pleaded, raising his hands though he didn't step in front of the gun. He was a coward down to his marrow. "Take the kid. Use her. Castiglione has a soft spot for the mother. I saw them together at the bakery. You can use the brat as leverage." Before Sergei could respond, the apartment windows shattered inward. Vincent's team executed a flawless, synchronized breach. Flashbang grenades detonated with blinding, deafening force, turning the living room into a sensory void. Sergei fired blindly, the bullet taking a chunk out of the ceiling, before a heavy combat boot kicked the weapon from his hand. But Sergei was a seasoned killer. Fighting through the disorientation, he lunged forward, grabbing Mia by the back of her shirt and hauling her up against his chest as a human shield. He pulled a serrated combat knife from his boot and pressed it against the child's throat. "Back off," Sergei roared over the ringing in the room, backing toward the shattered window that led to the fire escape. "Or I open her up right here." Vincent froze, his assault rifle raised. He tapped his earpiece. "Boss, we have a situation. Kozlov Lieutenant has the girl. He's got a blade to her throat." In the medical bay, Sylvia let out an agonizing, guttural scream, dropping to her knees. "Mia! Oh God, please no! Let them take me, please!" Dominic ignored his tearing stitches. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his face a mask of absolute, chilling calm. He snatched the comms microphone from the bedside table. "Put him on speaker, Vincent," Dominic ordered. A moment later, Dominic's voice echoed through the destroyed apartment on Hanover Street. "Sergei, it is Dominic Castiglione." Sergei laughed, a wet, nervous sound. "Castiglione, the rumors said you were gutted like a fish in an alley." "I am currently breathing," Dominic said, his tone devoid of inflection. "And you are holding a child who has nothing to do with our war. You want the territory? You want the shipping routes? You want me dead? That is the general idea, yes," Sergei sneered. "Then bring the rat. Greg Hayes, and the girl to the Charlestown Navy Yard. Pier 4. In 30 minutes, Dominic said, I will trade my life and my surrendered territory for the child. If you harm one single hair on her head, Sergei, I will not just kill you, I will skin you alive, salt the wounds, and mail your hide back to Moscow. Sergei hesitated. Capturing the head of the Castiglione family would make him a legend. 30 minutes. Come alone, Castiglione. The comms clicked off. The fog rolling in off the Atlantic Ocean was thick and freezing, clinging to the towering steel cranes of the Charlestown Navy Yard like ghosts. The smell of brine and rusted metal hung heavy in the air. Dominic stepped out of the armored Mercedes, leaning heavily on a silver-handled cane. Beneath his fresh, tailored black overcoat, his abdomen was tightly bound, the pain a searing white fire that he forcefully compartmentalized. He had not come alone, but his men were ghosts in the fog. The passenger door opened, and Sylvia stepped out. Dominic had ordered her to stay at the safe house, but she had fought him with the ferocity of a cornered lioness. She refused to let her daughter's fate rest solely in the hands of the Mafia. Headlights cut through the mist as two dark vans rolled down the pier, stopping 50 yards away. The doors slid open. Sergei stepped out, gripping Mia tightly by the arm. The little girl was crying softly, clutching her bear. Behind them, two heavily armed Russian thugs dragged Greg Hayes out by his collar. Sylvia choked back a sob, taking a step forward. Mia! Mommy! Mia cried out, struggling against Sergei's massive grip. Greg looked up, his eyes widening as he saw his ex-wife standing next to the most feared crime boss in New England. Sylvia? What the hell are you doing with him? You sold us out, Greg. Sylvia screamed, her voice cracking with fury and heartbreak, echoing off the empty shipping containers. You put a target on your own daughter for money. I had debts, Syl. They were going to kill me. Greg whined, struggling against his captors. Tell Castiglione to give them what they want. Dominic stepped in front of Sylvia, shielding her. He locked eyes with Sergei. Let the girl walk to her mother. You have me. You have the pier. Sergei smiled. A cruel, ugly expression. He raised his handgun, aiming it squarely at Dominic's chest. I think I will take you, the pier, and the girl. Kill them. Dominic didn't flinch. He simply tapped the silver handle of his cane against the wet asphalt. Crack, crack, crack. Before Sergei's men could even raise their weapons, 3 high-caliber sniper rounds tore through the fog. The two thugs holding Greg dropped instantly, their heads snapping back as the kinetic force threw them into the harbor. Sergei gasped, a bloom of red suddenly appearing on his right shoulder. His gun clattered to the ground as his arm went entirely numb. Before he could process the ambush, the shadows of the shipping containers peeled away. Vincent and a dozen of Dominic's elite enforcers materialized from the mist, their laser sights painting Sergei's chest with a dozen red dots. Mia, run! Sylvia screamed. The little girl broke free from the wounded Russian's slackened grip and sprinted across the wet asphalt. Sylvia dropped to her knees, catching her daughter in a desperate, crushing embrace. She buried her face in Mia's hair, weeping uncontrollably. Dominic walked slowly toward the remaining men. He bypassed the bleeding Sergei entirely and stopped in front of Greg Hayes, who was cowering on the ground, his hands over his head. Dominic pulled the Glock from his shoulder holster. He racked the slide, the metallic click. Please, Greg sobbed, a puddle of urine forming around his knees. I'm her father. I'm family. You ceased to be a father the moment you traded her life for your pathetic existence, Dominic whispered, his eyes black and merciless. He looked back at Sylvia, who was clutching Mia, watching the scene with wide, terrified eyes. Dominic's finger tightened on the trigger. It would be so easy. It would be justice. But he saw the way Sylvia trembled. If he pulled the trigger, he would save her from Greg, but he would permanently brand himself a monster in her eyes. He would trauma-scar the child forever. Slowly, Dominic lowered the weapon. Vincent, Dominic called out, never taking his eyes off the trembling coward. Strip him of everything. His phone, his wallet, his shoes. Throw him in the cargo hold of the freighter leaving for West Africa in 20 minutes. Greg gasped in relief, sobbing hysterically. If you ever step foot in the Northern Hemisphere again. Dominic leaned down, his voice dropping to a demonic whisper. I will find you, and I will not be merciful twice. Greg was violently dragged away into the fog. Dominic turned back to Sylvia. The adrenaline was finally wearing off, and the agonizing pain in his gut flared, causing him to stumble. Sylvia quickly stood up, holding Mia's hand, and rushed forward to catch his arm, supporting his weight. For the first time that night, Dominic looked down at the woman in the frayed coat, not as leverage, and not as collateral, but as something incredibly precious. It's over, Dominic breathed. You're safe. 1 week later, the storm had finally passed over Boston. Sylvia sat in the sun-drenched living room of a high-security penthouse overlooking the city skyline. It belonged to Dominic. He had insisted they stay until he could personally guarantee the total dismantling of the Kozlov syndicate, a promise he had ruthlessly kept over the past 7 days. The private elevator chimed softly. The steel doors slid open, and Genevieve, the baker from Pâtisserie Nouvelle, stepped out. She was escorted by Rocco, but this time, she wasn't terrified. She was beaming with immense pride. Rocco wheeled in a silver cart. On top of it sat the most magnificent cake Sylvia had ever seen. It was 5 tiers of flawless pastel pink fondant, adorned with handcrafted sugar roses, edible pearls, and a sparkling sugar glass topper that read, Happy 7th birthday, Mia. Mia let out a squeal of pure delight, running toward the cart. Mommy, look, it's beautiful. Sylvia covered her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. She turned to look at the doorway. Dominic stood there, leaning slightly on his cane. He had traded his ruined, blood-soaked suits for a soft cashmere sweater, softening the harsh, violent angles of his demeanor. He walked over to Sylvia, his dark eyes warm and remarkably gentle as he watched Mia excitedly inspect the sugar flowers. You didn't have to do all this, Sylvia whispered, looking up at him. You saved our lives. We owe you everything. You owe me nothing, Sylvia, Dominic replied, his raspy voice sending a shiver down her spine. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently brushing a stray auburn curl behind her ear. I destroyed your daughter's birthday cake. A Castiglione always pays his debts. Sylvia leaned into his touch, realizing that the cold, terrifying shadow in the booth had completely vanished. In his place was a man who had walked through fire for her, a man she was suddenly, overwhelmingly certain she never wanted to leave. Then, I suppose. Sylvia smiled softly, her heart beating wildly. We'll just have to share a slice. Sylvia never wanted the brutal mafia in her life. She only ever wanted a simple cake for her little girl. But in the darkest corner of a shattered bakery, she found a protector born of violence. Dominic Castiglione rebuilt her shattered world from the ashes of her broken past, proving that the most enduring love stories can begin with a single, desperate plea in the dead of cold night.